Thank you, everyone. It's wonderful to have you all here join us. Welcome to ABC's Post-Election Analysis webinar. My name is Vanessa Aramayo, and I am the Executive Director for Alliance for a Better Community. We are a Los Angeles Latino advocacy organization, and I'm excited to be moderating today's panel entitled Los Angeles Latino Latina Voting Power, a Post-Election Analysis. Today, we are joined by 5 incredible panelists that will be contributing their expertise to this conversation. Dr. Sarah Sarwani is an assistant professor of politics at Pomona College. Veronica Carizales is the vice president of policy and external affairs with California Calls. Efrain Escobedo, the vice president of public policy and civic engagement at the California Community Foundation. Lisette Escobedo, the Associate Vice President of Civic Engagement and Advocacy with Ultimate Health Services, and Oscar Cisco, the Program Coordinator with Council of Mexican Federations in North America, COFEM. I will gladly share more about each of these amazing panelists that are joining us today, but I did want to go over a few things as far as the structure for today's conversation and what you can expect in the program. The Latino vote, as you all know, is tremendously important in local and national elections. In Los Angeles County, we have 4.3 million registered voters, and nearly 1.2 of those voters are Latino. This is the highest percentage of Latino voters across the country. Given this potential power, what we wanted to know, and part of the reason why we are having this conversation here today, is how is it that Latinos voted in this year's election? What were some of the implications and what are the continuing implications of Latinos not voting locally and nationally? Another big question is, do we have an organized Latino-Latina electorate in Los Angeles County? And what is needed in order to successfully engage and increase voter education within our communities? This all brings me to the work of ABC. Alliance for a Better Community is committed to advancing social, economic, and racial equity and justice for the Latino community across the Los Angeles region, and we do this through power building and policy advocacy. The lack of a unified Latino voice on critical issues is what drove ABC's founders to establish this organization over 20 years ago. The need to increase opportunities in education, health, economic prosperity, and civic engagement is what continues to drive the organization's activism through public policy, advocacy, and power building. Last year, many of you were with us and know that we released our Latino Scorecard report. It was a policy roadmap for transforming Los Angeles. The report made recommendations to advance equity in 5 key areas where Latinos have made positive strides, yet continue to face systemic obstacles. And these included education, economic opportunity, civic engagement, public safety, and health. The report also included policy recommendations that capture the expertise of our partners, organizations, key stakeholders, community members, industry experts, as well as our board of directors. These policy recommendations affect one another, but the civic engagement recommendations speak directly to the impact of the importance of voter engagement and for our event today. The civic engagement recommendations included the following: increasing outreach funding and support for the new voting systems being implemented across Los Angeles County by the Registrar Recorder's Office, increasing responsibility of governments at all levels to develop targeted strategies to get out the vote, and investing in the funding of Latina serving community-based organizations, as well as Latino-led organizations in an effort to address and better understand the civic deserts that exist throughout our county. And this we see as being able to get completed and accomplished through increased research, capacity building, investments, and mobilization. The power of Latinos in this diverse region that we have and the contributions that our community makes culturally, socially, economic, and politically are vast. Engaging Latino voters would lead to more societal issues being addressed and to a more equitable and just Los Angeles. Without a doubt, we know that there is a link between political participation and the health of a community and a democracy. Across Los Angeles County, we have 9 civic deserts where 70% of the population is Latino. These same areas have higher rates of food insecurity, housing insecurity, joblessness, and education inequality compared to the rest of the county. These inequities must be addressed to not only improve the quality of life in our communities, but to ensure that everyone has an equal opportunity to exercise the right to vote. Today's panel will help us to better understand why greater targeted investments and strategies for Latino voter outreach are necessary. And so for today's structure, we're going to begin with Dr. Sarah Sidwani, who will start us off with a presentation covering a brief national, state, and local Latino voting trends. That'll be followed by Veronica Carrizales and Efrain Escobedo, who will join Dr. Sidwani for a brief conversation on what we saw in the presentation, along with some moderated questions. Once that concludes, we will transition to our second panel, where we will be welcoming Oscar Cisco and Lacera Escobedo to discuss their own organizational priorities with voter outreach, strategies at work, and how they're leveraging voter contact through their existing programs and services. That will then be followed by another opportunity to answer audience questions. So without further ado, and in hopes that the Zoom gods are on our side and we don't have any more technical problems, I'd like to introduce Dr. Sarah Sidwani to present. As I mentioned, I think I have another minute here. As I mentioned, she is an assistant professor of politics at Pomona College. She also specializes in American politics and race and ethnic politics. Her research has examined voting behavior, elections, voting rights, public opinion and public policy, and interest groups, with an emphasis on the representation of racial, ethnic, and immigrant communities. In addition, Dr. Sarah Sidwani has also joined Spectrum One News as a political anchor Alex Cohen on Inside the Issues. There's a podcast which brings listeners together on the world of Southern California politics that I highly recommend. Sarah, thank you so much for joining us here today.
Thanks so much for having me, Vanessa.
And I'm sorry you had trouble earlier.
No problem. I'm thankful to be here and so appreciative of the invitation to come and present today and talk a little bit about some of the trends that we're seeing. And so great to be back in community. I started my career in Los Angeles in community-based organizations and doing advocacy work at organizations like CHIRLA, what was then the Asian Pacific American Legal Center, now Asian Americans Advancing Justice, and the California Immigrant Policy Center, before going back to work on a PhD and learn all these data analytics. So I'm excited to be able to share a little bit of some of these preliminary assessments that we can do. Of course, we're still waiting on the final vote tally from the registrar's office, but I'm going to take a look at some of the data that's currently available and what some of that's looking like. I should also note, currently I'm on sabbatical. I'm also a visiting scholar at Stanford University, and I also served on the California Citizens Redistricting Commission, which I'll mention in brief, but very happy to talk more about it if there's additional questions about that work or the new districts that we have in place.
Excellent. Thank you. So excited to hear what you have to share. And just as you were running through the different community organizations you've been with, I just realized we have met and interacted on each of those. Yeah. It's incredible. I can't believe all this time has passed. It seems like just yesterday, but
I know it really does, right? It's,
so excited.
It's been a while. And then do I advance these slides myself, or is someone else doing that on the back?
Someone else is going to go ahead and do that. Just let them know when you want them to move forward.
Okay, perfect. So just before we get started, I'll talk a little bit about what I'm going to lay out today. I know Vanessa already kind of mentioned that. I'll talk a little bit about some of the national trends that we're seeing amongst Latino voter turnout and the importance of the Latino vote nationally. Then I'll turn and take a look at some of the research that's been coming out since the 2020 election. And of course, one of the big narratives that came out of the 2020 election was, is there a group of Latinos that might be moving towards the Republican Party and towards Trump and Trump Republicanism? And then I'll take a turn and look a little bit more locally. We'll take a brief look at some of the preliminary data that's available in terms of Latino turnout in LA County and the sheriff's race. We'll take a look at one congressional race as well as the mayor's race. So we can click to the first slide. So first of all, I can't imagine that this is a shocker to anyone on this call. Nationally, we know that Latinos are the margin of victory in a whole host of extraordinarily competitive races, not only here in California, but of course throughout the Southwest in places like Texas, New Mexico, Colorado, Arizona, Nevada. On the East Coast as well, we see Latinos growing in prominence in places like Georgia, North Carolina, Florida, of course, even places like Pennsylvania, which I'll talk about in just a moment. Let me go through to the next slide. In this election in 2022, Latinos were a major part of the narrative of fending off this supposed red wave that Democrats were very concerned about in states like Arizona, in the governor's race between Katie Hobbs and Kari Lake, and even in the Senate race with Mark Kelly. It was imperative for these candidates to be able to do outreach and turn out Latino voters. In Nevada with Catherine Cortez Masto in that Senate race, extraordinarily important to turn out Latino voters. And we saw candidates doing all sorts of work to connect with Latinos on the ground and to mobilize those votes. Georgia, of course, we know there is an upcoming runoff election, and I'm certain that Raphael Warnock is working hard to capture the vote of Latinos in the state of Georgia. And even in Pennsylvania, there was a significant project to turn out Puerto Rican voters on the eastern side of the state of Pennsylvania and ensure that they were a part of the work to deliver victories to Democrats. So this is very much a part of the national narrative that we continue to hear and see. Let me take a look at the next slide. That being said, also a part of the national narrative is that Latinos are not a monolith. I think, again, this comes as no surprise to anyone on this call, and that Latinos were also a major part of victories for Republicans as well. And we can look also at Georgia to the Governor Kemp's reelection campaign, which he won very smoothly. And we'll take a look at, not today, but in the few coming months, I'm sure we'll be able to further assess and analyze the data coming out of Georgia, taking a look at the Latino vote in that area. Certainly in places like South Texas and the Rio Grande Valley, we know that Latino voters were very much at play. There are 3 districts down in Texas that are all Latino majority seats. One of them went to a Republican, so certainly Latinos were a part of that. However, the shape, if we even just take a look at them and think about the recent redistricting process that just occurred, we'll note that some of the changes in the shape of those districts, some of the communities that have been pulled in, made it a little bit more likely and accessible for Republicans to secure that victory in the 15th congressional district. But that doesn't mean that all Latinos are going to line up behind the Democratic Party. And I think it's a trend that we need to continue taking a look at. Certainly in Florida, where there's a large community of Cubans and Venezuelans, we know that they have historically voted in support of the Republican Party, but this was the first election where we saw Miami-Dade County completely going to the Republican Party. Certainly they're a part of that conversation, but that is not to suggest that these are not trends that could potentially take root here in California and even here in Los Angeles. And we're going to take a look at some possible examples of how that might be happening. I wanted to point first to some new and emerging research from some of my colleagues, Bernard Fraga at Emory University, Yamil Velez at Columbia, and Emily West at the University of Pittsburgh. They have new research that was recently profiled by the New York Times, in which they analyzed trends from 2016 and 2020 and looked at the fact that there was an 8 percentage point shift in support from Hillary Clinton in 2016, the Democratic candidate for president, away from the Democrats, away from Joe Biden in 2020, and towards Trump. Click one more time. What they observe is that this trend exists, particularly amongst working class Latinos. They're taking a look at all different kinds of ways in which we might categorize Latinos into different buckets, whether it's gender, whether it's age, whether it's cohort, et cetera. And so some of the trends that they find is that working class Latinos is where a portion of this shift is occurring. And if you just think about the appeal of Donald Trump to voters in general across the United States, this makes a lot of sense. Much of his rhetoric has been very popular amongst working class white voters. And so we can see that this is perhaps also happening amongst working class Latinos. We can click one more time. There's some modest evidence of this pro-Trump shift that occurred amongst newly engaged US-born Latinos, children of immigrants. So in other words, those folks who are in the second generation, their parents came as immigrants, they have lived their entire life here in the United States and are maybe seeing politics through a slightly different light. In addition, they find some of the shift also occurring amongst Latino Catholics. We can click once more. And ultimately, their research suggests that this is a more durable trend than currently assumed. And I want to focus in on that, because I think some of the analysis that is coming out nationally is that we need to keep paying more attention to these shifts amongst Latinos, because that trend stayed in 2022, right? That there's this small proportion of Latinos that used to perhaps vote Democratic that are not voting with the Democratic Party anymore. And so who are they? Why are they? For whom does the Democratic Party appeal to Latinos? For whom might Republicans be more appealing? Click. I wanted to point a little to some of the research that was happening just prior to the election in surveys asking what are the most important issues that elected officials should address. This is a survey conducted by BSP Research. Of course, this research is at UCLA in conjunction and collaboration with Mi Familia Vota and Unidos. And what we can see is there's a whole host of issues that Latino voters said was important. We can click. Of course, if we go back real quick, the first circle there, oh, sorry. That first circle will show that this was the messaging that was really used by Republicans, focusing their narrative for the 2022 election on cost of living, inflation, crime, jobs. If we click again, we'll see that Democrats focus their message instead on abortion. There was a laser-focused messaging on abortion. If we click once more, however, we'll see that abortion is really in and around the same level of importance to Latino voters as the environment, affordable housing, government corruption. Click one more time. We'll see that my co-author, Mike Mendez, who is also, I believe, on the board of directors for ABC, he and I wrote about this shortcoming, that this messaging towards Latinos nationally is perhaps falling somewhat short, particularly on climate, that many Latinos are facing the brunt of climate change and climate disasters, from excessive heat to all sorts of other components, and that there's a real opportunity for Democrats to do more to link that to the economy. I want to click really quickly and look at, before my time is up, at some of the trends here in LA County, as Vanessa laid out early on in this presentation. The number of Latino registered voters has been increasing in LA County exponentially over the course of the last decade. We can click one more time. And click, yeah, thank you. Preliminary assessments from Political Data Incorporated, PDI, which is what most folks are using to take a look at voting trends, at least until all of the finalized data is released. However, shows that despite the fact that Latinos comprise a significant proportion of the electorate, turnout looks to be fairly low in LA County. This is LA County data as of November 28th, 32% turnout rate, which is fairly low, even in a midterm election. If we click once more, we'll see Latino turnout. This is data pulled from the statewide database. There are some differences in terms of how these various data sources will identify Latinos. But what we can see is overwhelmingly in these midterm elections, so if we're looking at 2010, 2014, 2018, we can see that Latino turnout tends to drop significantly in the midterm election in comparison to presidential elections. If that 32% stays, I'm hoping that it will shift a little bit higher once we have final data. It looks like turnout was pretty low amongst Latinos. And click again. We'll take a look very quickly. We've begun to do some preliminary analysis. Again, we are waiting on final data from the LA County Registrar's Office. This is in collaboration with my colleague, Professor Tyler Rennie at Claremont Graduate University. We're taking a look here at vote choice. Of course, ballots are secret ballots. We do not know how people actually voted. We can ask them in an exit poll, or we can assess by the precincts in which they live and take a look at those precincts that have a higher proportion of Latinos in them. So if you're familiar with this kind of analysis, it's used in Voting Rights Act cases to identify the candidate of choice for a racialized community. What we're looking at here is county-wide. When we take a look at as the percentage of Latinos increases in a precinct, and remember, those are small geographic units where people vote, we can see that support for Villanueva actually increased as the proportion of Latinos increased in a precinct. However, it was fairly split between Villanueva and Luna. Click one more time. We can, if we move to the northern parts of Los Angeles County, I think one race people aren't paying a whole lot of attention to, which I think is unfortunate in terms of the Latino vote, is the 27th Congressional District, which of course, as a member of the Redistricting Commission, I certainly played a hand in drawing this district. This is a district that is 56% non-white citizen voting age population. Among those, about 35% of the electorate in this district is Latino. And of course, they elected Mike Garcia, incumbent Republican and Latino, back to Congress in a district that leans Democratic. So I think there's a lot to unpack in this district. We can click again. We'll take a look very quickly at the mayoral race. I know that there is a strong desire to have a narrative here about the racial coalition between Black and Latinos that elected Karen Bass. However, preliminary data, this was released from the LA County Registrar and posted on the LA Times website as of November 15th, which was the day in which they called the election for Karen Bass, shows that there's really some division as we see some of the neighborhoods in East LA, El Sereno, further up into the San Fernando Valley, places like Sylmar and Chatsworth, areas where there's a large proportion of Latinos in those districts. It looks like some of these Latino neighborhoods are supporting Caruso. Again, a mayoral race, of course, is a nonpartisan race. Both of these candidates were technically running as Democrats. If we click one more time, using the same data set, running that same kind of analysis as we showed in the sheriff's race, you can see that, again, as the proportion of Latinos increases in the precincts, we're seeing support for Caruso increase. So from a statistical analysis perspective, this would suggest that Rick Caruso was, to some extent, more so the candidate of choice amongst Latinos in various neighborhoods, not all neighborhoods, obviously. But I think there's plenty more to unpack, plenty more to assess in terms of this data as the full count comes out. And I just want to stress that this is preliminary data of what has been released thus far. If we click one last time, I believe, or actually, sorry, I have a one full more slide here. There's a couple clicks to come. Opportunity, as some of the initial analysis coming out of 2022, the opportunity for Latino representation was at an all-time high. Because of the work at the Citizens Redistricting Commission, we increased the number of Latino majority minority districts exponentially, an increase 6 more Latino majority minority districts from 2010 up to 16 increases in the state Senate and state assembly. And we're seeing those changes now that several pieces have come out in the SACB and other places talking about the kind of diversity that we are seeing being elected to the legislature, a whole host of women being also elected as well. We can take a click for second point. As of right now, Latino turnout appeared pretty low in the 2022 elections. And despite significant changes to election laws and voting opportunities, I think some of the other panelists are going to talk about some of these shifts that we've seen in recent years. the mail-in ballots going out to everyone, vote centers, early voting. There's plenty of opportunities for folks to vote. And yet we see that perhaps there's some sort of mismatch that's occurring for Latinos in particular, that perhaps more work may need to be done to actually increase the amount of education about these changes and secure, people, secure people's feelings about them, making sure people feel that this is a secure way of voting. There's one more click. Overwhelmingly, Latinos continue to support Democrats, but we can point to numerous counterfactuals, not only nationally where we've seen some of this shifting away from Democrats, but also here in Southern California as well. We didn't talk about it, but CA 22, David Valadeo in that district, that's again a Latino majority minority district. We spent a lot of time drawing that district at the commission, and it did not go to the Latino candidate, but instead to Valadeo. There's one last click. And that's it for me. Thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to come and talk with you today. I'm happy to take questions. All of my contact info is here. And as Vanessa said, please be sure to check out Inside the Issues, the podcast. It comes out weekly on Thursdays.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Sarah. So much information here to process and to really keep an eye out as those final numbers start to come out from the county. With that, I'd like to just dive right into this. I want to invite Veronica Carizales and Efrain Escobedo to join us for this conversation. Veronica is the Vice President of Policy and External Affairs with California Calls. She spearheaded policy analysis and coalition building for the organization and led the 2020 coalition Schools and Communities First. This, as many of you might remember, was an effort to significantly increase funding for public schools, community colleges, and local services by reforming Prop 13's commercial property system. She leads now an expansion into new regions of the state and shapes policy analysis, continues to maintain partnerships with key statewide alliances. And we have had many rich conversations about these elections, which has been like a telenovela, has it not, Veronica? So I'd like to welcome Veronica. I'd also like to introduce Efrain Escobedo, who many of you know is the Vice President of Public Policy and Civic Engagement with the California Community Foundation, CCF. Efrain has dedicated his career to increasing civic engagement and to ensuring that public policies and institutions not just serve, but also empower our communities. Efrain has worked nationally and locally on efforts to increase citizenship and voter participation in the census, and is recognized nationally and locally as an active leader and expert in Latino civic engagement and election policy. Thank you both for joining us here today. I'd like to begin with each of you by just asking to have you share some brief reactions and some thoughts regarding some of the information that was just shared by Sarah. I know you both have also had an inroads to additional information on turnout and what some of those final numbers are going to be looking at, we're going to be looking like. So I'd love to get just some initial reactions on the presentation and on the data we have so far.
Juanica, I'll defer to you if you want to kick us off and get us going.
Sure. I can kick us off. I wanted to say, even though La Reina del Sur came to Los Angeles to support Caruso, it was ultimately Karen Bass, who was La Reina de Los Angeles, by ultimately winning that race. I wanted to just, I had like a knee-jerk reaction as Sarah was going over the numbers, both for the state and then locally. As we know, the numbers that came out in the LA Times were reflective of the ballots that had come in up to that date. What we know is that many people of color, they voted by mail, they voted, they mailed in their ballots on election day. And so their votes are the votes that are actually coming in after the election. And so when you look at the Karen Bass race where she made that jump, right? She was like neck to neck with Caruso, and then she made that jump to have a 10% increase. That was a result of all the ballots that came in that were mailed during election day, that people that voted on election day, and it was like all those vote by mail ballots. So once we get the final numbers, I think it'll be interesting to really look at what Latino voter participation was. I did have Lydia Avila, who's our field director crunch some numbers. I know the PDI data just came out this weekend, and I think last night Lydia was crunching the numbers for us to just give us a sense. And Sarah's right. Latino voter participation was lower than what we have previously seen in elections. In the city of Los Angeles for the November 2022 election, the latest data shows that about 31.7% of Latino voters turned out for LA City. And then for LA County, it was about 35.8% of Latino voters. One significant thing to point out was that 35.8% of Latino voter turnout for LA County is slightly higher than the turnout for LA City, but it's still 11 percentage points less than all voters. And I think more importantly, it's 21% less than white voters, right? And so when we think about who is making the decisions in Los Angeles as it relates to electing key candidates or around passing progressive policy solutions, the brunt is falling on majority white voters. And so there's many reasons why we're not seeing Latino voter participation at the numbers that we would like to see. One of the big reasons is misinformation, right? Or no information about the upcoming election, misinformation about how to vote by mail. And voters are still confused about how to vote and are still getting misinformation about how to participate. I think a lot of times people think about, they talk about Latino low turnout as voter apathy, but really, you know, and I was part of the effort volunteering for the Karen Bass campaign in Boyle Heights, leading the volunteer canvas in Boyle Heights and in Lincoln Heights. And really, I think there was two issues. One, Latino voters not being fully aware of all the issues related to the upcoming election. But I think more importantly than voter apathy, it's just the Latino voters struggling to survive, right? Struggling with inflation, struggling to make ends meet, struggling to pay rent, and dealing with housing insecurity. And so that was one of the big issues. And I think the other big issue and was not getting touched by major campaigns, like major campaigns not actually doing the outreach to Latino voters because they want to fall on that always voter, and that always voter is going to be a white voter, right? And so we need to get the campaigns to invest in Latino voters, to do the outreach. I'm proud that I was able to help lead a volunteer effort for Karen Bass on the East Side, and we saw a lot of voter support on the East Side, but we saw a lot of split households, where we saw the women in the household supporting candidate Bass, Mayor Bass, and then the men in the household actually going with Caruso. When we get the final numbers, I'd love to see if we were seeing that across the city, or were we just seeing it in certain segments of the city? And so I think that's an interesting trend. So not having enough information, and I think we have to come back to the issue of immigration status is a continued issue that impacts and disenfranchises our community by not having people not having the ability to vote. So I'll stop there and kick it off to Efrain to go next.
Thank you. Yeah, Efrain, what resonates with you the most of what has been shared just recently?
Well, I think I'll share not what resonates with me, but I hope resonates with participants and political observers. And the first, and Veronica, well said. I wanted to kick it off to you because I was like, try and make sure we had a voice, but I'll share three sort of reflections that I think I hope are things that people don't take away, but that spring folks into sort of deep interrogation about where we're going, right? If our ultimate goal is to build a multiracial democracy, and that is that when you look at the results that Dr. Sadwani and that Veronica have shared, at the end of the day, what it translates into is the decisions around how LA County is governed and represented. In that decision, Latinos made up 26% of the voice that was deciding that. And when you look at demographic, even if you go just at citizen voting age population, Latinos make up 40% of the citizen voting age population in LA County. Whites make up 31%, but they made up, in Sarah's presentation, right? They're still the majority weight of the voice of how things are being decided in LA County. And so I think that's a serious thing for us to interrogate if we are all working to build a multiracial democracy in LA County. I think the other for me is that, while we look at voice choices, I think the way we should be looking at it projecting forward is this has been an opportunity for the mayor of Los Angeles to say, how do I build a deeper relationship now from a governance standpoint? We all know how retail politics plays out and how you can spend money to create name ID and get influence, right? You can go hire 500 people and pay them $50 an hour. And it will have dividends, as we can see. But those numbers we should take as not, oh, Latinos want a Caruso. That's not it. What they're saying is, there's opportunity for relationship, and it's more of I think, a goal for the new mayor to say, I need to go to those precincts, and how do I build relationships there to understand how I govern with those communities, is a takeaway for me and something that helped me reflect and react to those numbers. And then the last point about it, and this goes to some of the national trends, is we need to get serious about what is the civic engagement or integrated voter engagement infrastructure that is led by Latinos in these communities, for Latinos in these communities, and less about outside work coming in, because that's not going to get the job done. That's still retail type of mercenary type of democracy. And so the honest truth is, in LA County, there actually is not very many organizations that are led by Latinos, grounded and cemented in these communities. And in the ones where there are, right, where there is an ABC or there is an intercity struggle, you see the difference and you see what happens there. So I think we need to look at the fact that we don't have a lot compared to the number of people that we're serving in the county. And that leads to then also sort of, when we look at Latino vote choice, we need to stop looking at the Latino electorate from the two-party system paradigm and from an immigrant voter paradigm. Yeah. This is a native-born, fully LA, US-based electorate that cares about immigration the same way I care about my tia and my abuela, but I got aspirations and I have goals and I'm native-born, right? And we haven't broke out of that dynamic. And also the fact that, saying Democrat and saying Republican, honestly, it's been so long since IRCA, and Democrats really haven't done much on the immigration side, that there's nothing to connect to, say, as in the Black community and the struggles around civil rights and some of the fights around police and justice reforms, right? That I think that does not motivate Latinos to say we need to help Democrats win. I think we're seeing time and time again that is not what is going to get some of these demographics, like what Veronica was talking about in those split households. They need a new framework. They're looking for a new way and new motivation to vote. I think they're ultimately values aligned. We're just not approaching it from the right frame. So those are my takeaways, I think.
Thank you. And you answered the next question, because I was going to talk about the headline after every election, which is Latinos are a monolith, right? That the monolith is always a headline somewhere locally or nationally in our news. And I wanted to ask you what you think some misconceptions are about Latino voters, but Efrain, you have started that conversation already on how we are more than monolingual Spanish speakers, only interested in immigration reform, et cetera, et cetera. I'd like to ask you directly, and also for your input, Sarah and Veronica, as far as misconceptions around Latino voters, but I want to pair that with what are some ideas on whether Los Angeles County actually has an organized Latino electorate. People talk about Latino voters, they talk about how we're not a monolith. What are the opportunities right now, having the data, the research, the experience on the ground and in the field, that can inform how we are approaching Latino voters moving forward? And answering the broader question, do we have an organized Latino electorate in LA County? Sarah, let me pitch it to you first.
Sure. So I think your first question was actually about some of those misconceptions, right? And I want to go back to some of the research of my colleagues that I mentioned, because I think there's a lot of scholars, many of my colleagues are working to really break down and better understand the Latino communities of voters, because absolutely all of these changes, these separations, I won't use the word divisions, but between immigrants who have naturalized versus native born, folks that were born and raised here who are second generation, and even now the folks who are third generation or fourth generation, right? The Latino community isn't new. It's certainly not in California. And even in many of these other states where they matter, they're folks that have deep roots into communities. And we need to better understand those roots and what brings people to the table to vote. It's why we wrote that piece in Time Magazine about climate change, because when we look at the analysis, though so much of the narrative going into the election was, hey, Latinos care about abortion too. That's not wrong. It's absolutely true. But they care about it at about the same rate as some of these other issues that we could be connecting to folks on. And we're not bothering to do that. And I get it, campaign resources are limited, and so it's not possible to do all of that work. But I think that the points that Efrain and Veronica made about doing that outreach is so crucial. I started my project analyzing and observing the mayor's debate because we've already had almost 20 years of survey data that has said the same exact thing, that Latinos and Asian Americans every single election cycle will report, no one bothered to knock on my door. No one bothered to call me. When is that going to change, right? Like, at what point is that going to change? And if candidates aren't going to do it, if Democrats aren't going to do it, someone else is going to step in and fulfill that role. And I think that that's a part of what we might be seeing. And I think why we need to be taking a look at this question. In terms of the organized Latino electorate, I'll leave it to the organizers to answer that question. I certainly think, given that survey data, that there's more to be done, that Latinos are sophisticated, are complex, have multiple issues that they're interested in, that there's, as Veronica identified, there's divisions between men and women, between older generations and younger generations. I mean, look at the election of Eunice Hernandez, right? I mean, that's a younger cohort of voters who are coming out to support her, but also in neighborhoods that are changing dramatically, right? And so I think there's so many different components to this piece that we have to really think about, but it's up to campaigns as well as organizing efforts to think about how to do that mobilization in the future. 2024 is right around the corner.
Thank you, Sarah. And also, I'm so glad that you're touching on the fact that so much data is already available and what is working in the ground and how the field really informs that, which is what our second panel is going to be focused on. But Veronica, from both the field perspective and from a policy perspective, because you have really a very unique perspective on how this works and how voters have been engaged. What are your thoughts on these two questions?
When I think about what happened, we're seeing a rise in new left candidates getting elected. And I think that's hopeful, because you're seeing that voters want something different. Voters want someone who's going to take care of the issues that they care about most. Now, when I think about the Karen Bass and Caruso race in Los Angeles, there really was a war taking place on the streets. And I was doing work on the East Side and in Lincoln Heights as a volunteer, but it really was like a war between the Caruso camp and the Bass camp. And we're talking $110 million versus $11 million. So the fact that Karen Bass was ultimately able to win was significant. But it was this challenge of, how do you get to voters? How do you talk to voters? And then how do you combat all these messages coming in, right? We're seeing huge amounts of money from corporations on a broad range of issues, and they're using their money to confuse voters about the issues. So stepping away from candidates, right? So candidate races, that's difficult. You're up against, you know, like I said, Karen Bass was up against $110 million to her $11 million, 11 times more. Aside from that, then you have major issues that are coming up around initiatives. Prop 15 was a major issue that I worked on. Just today, there was a referendum that was passed that's actually going to overturn some of the gains that were won for fast food workers. And when you think about Latinos in the fast food industry, right, it's majority Black and Latino in the fast food industry, majority women. And so you now have referendums getting placed on the ballot by large corporations. And so large corporations, what they're doing is they're using their money to confuse voters. They're targeting Latino voters. They're doing geo-targeting so that when their canvassers knock on the doors right afterwards, they'll get a commercial in their household talking about a particular candidate or talking about a particular issue. And so the reality is we're up against large sums of money, and we're not doing enough to invest in Latino outreach. We're not doing enough to basically go back to the basics, right? Going back to the basics and doing door-to-door outreach, making the calls, identifying voters, and then making sure that voters are turning out. And we're not doing enough to do it as community-based organizations. Campaigns are not doing enough. And so I think the onus and the responsibility still falls on us to make the case, right? We're still in this situation where we're having to make the case to campaigns that Latinos are worth investing in. And I think we have the data that they're worth it, but we have to actually prove that Latino voters will turn out. And that's where we have to continuously go back and invest in the infrastructure and push, right? The Secretary of State and push elected officials to do outreach in language to Latino voters.
I'm glad you talked about investments. Efrain, I'm gonna put it to you from a philanthropic perspective, because you do see it from this perspective, right? How we're pushing others, but also the investments that come from philanthropy are substantial because they help to build a capacity. So what are your thoughts around why have the investments not been sustainable? What do you think are the challenges here, and what are the opportunities for greater, real, sustainable investments?
Sure, that's a great question, Vanessa, and Veronica signed me up. You got me all fired up right on that last comments. But I just wanted to share one thing, which is just plus one in what Veronica and Sarah made, and that is, polls don't make electorates. Movements make electorates. And so, every 2 years we want to get the Latino vote out and all of a sudden they're important does not make an electorate. It's the year-round, like Veronica said, it's the year-round fights. It's movement creating fights, like the fight for Prop 15 that create those things, and you need community-based organization to build those movements, right? And so I think that goes into the philanthropy piece, to the consultant piece. It's like, it's not about polling and what issues Latinos care about. It's about movements, having them an opportunity to realize their power and start building it. That will create that, right? And to your question, I think there's two things here. And Veronica started to allude, and I saw a question in the chat or in the Q&A segment. There's two transformative things I think we can do in LA County and California in general. And that is, let's make government more responsible for making sure that people are educated and find the process, not just accessible in a legally defined way, but comfortable to where it's my process and I can do it. To me, I think part of the low Latino voter participation relative to other communities that have high poverty rates and are of color, like AAPI and Black communities, the fact that we're 10 percentage point Black, and it's consistent now. We saw that in the primary and in the general, to me starts to signal, does the Voters' Choice Act and the new voting formats, are they having a disparate impact on Latinos? It is government's responsibility to invest dollars to figure that out and change it. So to your question, Carolina, in the Q&A, yes, I think the county needs to invest more in an equity perspective, saying we really need to hone in on Latinos. We can't just do these generic voter education things. So does the Secretary of State, that state should put more money like we did with census and hard to count communities to get the education up. And I say that in response to your question, Vanessa, because then the job of philanthropy is not to support a democratic process. It's to support the building of power and movements. So then philanthropy's role needs to be more concrete in shedding its retail approach to organizations. If you look at organizations that do historically the get off the boat work, philanthropy has perpetuated this very cyclical boom and bust, feast and famine cycle that doesn't now allow organizations to grow, increase their scale, and reach. California, we're fortunate we have a little bit more forward-looking philanthropy, but more needs to be done to educate philanthropy in who is being left behind in this power-building renaissance that California is going through. And you need to commit to building infrastructure in those areas year-round, just an election.
Thank you. We have time for one we have some Q&A, and I appreciate that you started to answer some of those, Efrain. I do want to ask you all, we have time for one recommendation from each of you, something that you would leave our audience with today as we gear up for 2023, looking at not highly active election year, and then really using that as a stepping stone to 2024, where again, the stakes are huge and high. What is one recommendation that you would want an audience, whether they're representing philanthropy, a community-based partner, a research partner, to walk away with from this conversation? And we'll start with Veronica.
Well, my one recommendation is get in the game. That's my recommendation. So whether you're a C3, predominantly only do C3 work, or whether you're a C3 and you also do C4 work, you have to get in the game. And what that means is making sure you're doing voter outreach, making sure you're doing voter education. We've had some great reforms in California with vote by mail, the Voters' Choice Act, with the passage of Proposition 17, which re-enfranchised voting rights for voters that were on parole. We've done a lot of great work, but the problem is that many voters still are having issues with how to vote, where to vote. And then for the Latino population, we're still seeing problems with mismatched signatures. So even if you're a C3 organization and you're like, well, we don't do partisan work, that's fine. Get in the game, do education, do voter outreach. If you don't have a voter outreach component, you're not in the game, and you're only doing half the work that's needed to make change in California. The only way we're going to make change is if we build political power, right? We have to build political power for disenfranchised communities, for Latino communities in Los Angeles and across the state. So this is a mandate to all of you listening. You have to get in the game. You have to invest in civic engagement work, and you have to invest in it year round. It can't be a one-shot deal. There's many organizations that know how to do this and can provide resources and support so that you can do it right. And there's funding available to do it. So get in the game, get it done. That's my recommendation.
Damn, that makes you want to go out. I mean, I was already in it, but now I want to do even more. Sarah.
I mean, how do you follow that? Of course. I mean, I completely support that. Get in the game, like building the Latino power is the path to the future, right? I mean, and don't get me wrong, I can recommend more research. We need to know more about Latinos in East LA versus the San Fernando Valley versus South LA, et cetera. And all of that is true. But I think having more folks get in the game and help to build a Latino political power for the future is absolutely a recommendation for the future.
Thank you. Efrain.
Ditto everything that's been said. And the last thing I'll say is this is also the year, building on all that, this is also the year to think about, like, folks, there's 36 attendees. What is the folks that could join coalition to get the Secretary of State, to get the registrar, to focus right now, make the changes now, to let's get voter ed right. Like Veronica said, we've got all the progressive ways we should all be voting, but we just need a little bit more investment and work. There's a lot of people here that could become a strong coalition, but the advocacy has to be now in 2022 and 2023, not in 2024, because they're just going to tell you it's too late to do it.
Exactly. Absolutely. I am so grateful to the three of you. We could probably do this for 2 hours more. I welcome you to stay on as we talk about what are the strategies that are working on the field with our next panel and our two incredible speakers that are going to be joining us. But my thanks to you, the three of you. And let's go ahead and move on to the next panel. I would like to now welcome Oscar Cisco and Lisette Escobedo to join the conversation. Oscar is the program coordinator with COFEM, and he was also the co-chair of a field program that he co-led with ABC in Southeast LA. We were doing exactly that, getting in the game and increasing voting power. There, he leads the peer-to-peer outreach program. Oscar also assists with various projects and programs covering immigration, civic and environmental advocacy. And we're really grateful for his joining our panel today. I also want to welcome Lisette Escobedo, who is the Associate Vice President of Civic Engagement and Advocacy at Altamed Health Services, where she brings over a decade of experience on social and political campaigns and building Latino voter outreach efforts. Lisette has helped lead the implementation of the New Americans campaign in Los Angeles, Miami, New York, Dallas, and Charlotte. And she's also launched the DACA, the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, National Bilingual Hotline. Welcome to you both, Lisette and Oscar. It's great to have you here.
Excited to be here.
Great. So I want to start after that first panel and some of that data that you all had already been privy to, both because of the presentation that had been shared, but really because you've been living this and you have been putting a lot of the work to use and really implementing a lot of the strategies that have been working on the field. I wanted to start with Oscar. If you could share just a bit about some of COFEM's priorities and really focus on why is voter outreach important to the work that the organization is doing?
Well, thank you for having me, Vanessa, and hi, Lizette. It's good to see you. COFEM we view GOTV and we view the vote as a cyclical thing, not just an election cycle. We're talking about a 10-year process. We started with getting people counted in the census, and we advocated. We're pushing for that because that's where the power comes from. Getting counted, that's where districts are drawn. Everything starts from there. And then we move on with our programs. And so in COFEM, one of our biggest programs is a citizenship program where we have people, come out, we do the application for free, and people, become citizens. And then they get the right to vote. And that's the purpose for people to take that oath and becoming citizens, is to get the right to vote. That is everything, and that's everything we want to do, and that's why we also advocate to get out the vote. It's because this is it. All of our programs, whether it be water talks, where we're advocating for clean water in Los Angeles, and with the Nature for All Coalition, and talking about conservation or immigration reform, IRLA, Immigrants Are LA, advocating for equitable recovery from COVID. All of this is to equip the community leaders, our civic promoters, to get them involved, to get them invested in their community, to feel a part of it, like they are making a difference. And not that they feel like they are, but they actually are. And all of this culminates with getting out the vote. Because I believe that if you're only trying to get out the vote for the primary and the general election, it's too late. It's too late. You can't knock on someone's door for like 30 seconds and convince them like that to get out to vote.
Missed opportunity.
You want them to be invested and to get involved in the community and to connect with them, to talk about the issues that matter to us, and get them to buy in to the whatever we're advocating for, which is immigration, conservation, whatever. And that's where it starts. And the Civic Promoters Program is essentially the cornerstone to all this. I guess we'll talk a little bit more about that. But and I guess that's essentially what we do here.
Right. And I really love that you are pairing that building political power that Veronica was talking about earlier with the systems change work, right? Because there's an opportunity there that's being missed if you are trying to advocate for policies and changes, whether they have to do with funding, which is so broad and really trickles down at such a local level, or you're trying to advocate for a bill change of some sort at the state level. So I think really understanding that is what COFEM has historically been doing, and I'm so happy that you are sharing that. Lisette, you have spent much, if not all, of your career on increasing voter turnout wearing so many different hats. I'm really looking forward to having you share the work that you're currently leading out at AltaMed. I know you have a presentation for us. I'm happy to pass this over to you now.
Awesome, sure. And you actually took me back, Vanessa. You're going through my bio. I was like, oh, that's right. I did do those things. It's been so many years. So yeah, I'm happy. Do you want me to go through the presentation, or do you want me to just kind of talk a little bit? Okay, perfect. Let's go
ahead and go through it. There's some really good kernels in there that I want to make sure people see.
Awesome. All right. So wait for the presentation to go up. Again,
Andrew will get it up. Yes. And just go ahead and let him know when you're ready to switch slides. Here we go.
Awesome. All right. Let's get it started. We can go to the next slide. So a little bit about why we do this work at AltaMed, right? A lot of folks are wondering, what does AltaMed have to do with civic participation and voter engagement? Well, for us, it's very simple. It's about the social determinants of health. When our over 400,000 patients come to any of our 50 sites across LA County and Orange County, we know that we can only help them with about 20% of their health, right? We can give them medicine, we can give them a diagnosis, et cetera. Our providers can help them, but 80% of their health is determined by the conditions that they live in and they have in their communities. Meaning, do they have access to healthy food, clean water, transportation, affordable housing? And so in order to change the conditions in a transformational way for our patients, we have to make sure that, as Vanessa was talking about, we see these systems changes. One, in who is in power, who we're electing, what policies they're passing, what funding they're supporting, and also the propositions that we're passing, right? Are we determining that affordable housing is something we want to expand in LA County, in the city of LA, right? We saw many ballot measures this time around. And so for us, civic engagement is core to making our communities whole and healthy in a substantial way. Next slide. And the other piece here that I always talk about, because when being on the other end of just kind of doing civic engagement work before I came on board with AltaMed, there was research study after research study. Where I used to work at Naleo, I worked at for many years, all of our research studies around civic engagement and who are the trusted messengers around the census, elections, and other important civic engagement topics. It always came back that in Latino communities, the most trusted messengers are nurses, doctors, and teachers. That was, again, proven by a recent study that was done amongst LA County Latino voters and the Pat Brown Institute, that again had Latinos identify healthcare professionals as someone who had their best interest in mind. And so not only, again, are we addressing health in a substantial way, and we want to address the community, we have access to those patients in some of those the most vulnerable communities by way of our being a federally qualified health center, but we also have the most trusted messengers within our provider network, within our doctors. And so part of what we do at AltaMed is when we talk to our doctors, when we talk to our medical residents, civic engagement is integrated throughout, including new hire orientation, medical resident orientation, so that folks understand the key role that them as providers play in making sure that the community understands the message of civic engagement. Next slide. So how do we do it? We look at it in three kind of different pillars. One is an in-clinic patient engagement and increasing voting access. So folks heard integrated civic engagement quite a lot today. I think the way that we've been able to do it at AltaMed is an example of that, where we do year-long civic engagement, meaning my team and I have the privilege and honor of having access to all of our clinics across both LA County and Orange County, and having the opportunity to include civic engagement education in the service provision process. That means that when a patient comes into the clinic, There's information available around the upcoming election. There's posters, there's QR codes. When they check in with their doctor, most of our doctors now have badges with the QR code that takes them to the voter registration website. And so the idea is every part of that service provision comes integrated with a key civic engagement message. Additionally, our sites have, many of our sites have started serving as vote centers. We partnered with LA County Registrar of Voters as well as Orange County to designate either drop-off sites or vote centers to be some of our clinics. That means that I get to register to vote at an Altamed, I get my voter education at Altamed, and then I can vote at Altamed. And we've seen some pretty high numbers across the board at all of our clinics because we have the built environment, again, of the most vulnerable communities that are often unreached, and we have access to them by way of this work. We also engage our staff in our executive leadership. Over 80% of our staff come from the communities that we serve. And we have about 3,800 staff throughout all of our clinics. And so we know that when we engage staff, we're also engaging community, and we're likely engaging the leaders in these communities. And so we have all staff information and education that consistently goes out. We do trainings. Folks actually in the network that they use to submit their timesheets, et cetera, there are actually downloadable civic engagement trainings that they can get. And so integrated across the board. And then the last piece for us is we know that in order to have true transformational change for our patients, we have to also invest and transform the communities that they go back into. So we've developed a model where we look at 5 mile radius within each of our clinics, and we launch full out get out the vote efforts where we do door knocking, texting, phones, and we focus on areas where we have high patient density because we know that that's where they would trust us more to do this work. And I'll talk a little bit about the effectiveness of this. Next slide. So this past election, here's some numbers that we were able to accomplish for the general. We were able to reach approximately 500,000 Latino voters in both LA County and Orange County. We partnered with Se La Voz, Mi Familia Vota in LA County, and a couple of other folks. We actually were able to even reach folks in San Diego County. Next slide. And these are the slides that I wanted to get to because I think these are really important. In areas where voters have been contacted by Altamed since 2014 in various campaigns, whether it's the 2018 campaign, 2020, or the 2020 census, we saw a significant increase amongst those voters that were contacted at least 3 times, especially in increasing turnout in Southeast LA regions that we targeted and in East LA and Boyle Heights region. So here you see some increases in turnout, right? So we see that consistent communication, long-term integrated civic engagement, our role as a trusted messenger, and our consistent communication with patients who trust us are key to increasing turnout for our work. Next slide. And again, here we saw an increase across the board in terms of who was turning out based on who we were targeting. This is for the primary election, by the way, because we're also waiting for the general. So my apologies, I should have prefaced that. But we used all these learnings from what were the regions that we had a bigger increase in turnout. That's where we focused on for the general. A combination of doors and phones worked best for us, specifically doors, whatever doors we actually had a contact with ended up turning out to vote. And so we use this formula, right, of, again, trusted messenger and integrated civic engagement to go out into the general election and do the same. Next slide. So here are some of the lessons that we applied. Voters contacted, again, across multiple elections show the greatest increase in participation. We've been talking about this, sustainability, long-term contact, not just every election cycle. Voters contacted at the door along with the phone outperformed other voters. This is what we saw during the primary that we used for the general. Voters who are more likely to be our patients show increased likelihood to vote based on voter outreach efforts. So in essence, integrated civic engagement efforts work. We see it, we've done it, and we have some proven successes from it, and we hope to continue to do it. We'll see the numbers in the general, but we suspect that they'll be very similar. Next slide. And I know I have to wrap up here, so I'm gonna kind of just skip through the slides here. Next slide. Here, just a list of where we had some of our vote centers. So I'll skip that again. Folks will get access to some of these slides. And I'll leave it at that because I know we have some great conversations that we'll have through Q&A. And I'll toss it back to you, Vanessa.
Thank you so much, Lisette. And I wish we had more time because I want to get into maybe in one of your responses, you can touch on this, why you all are targeting Latina voters, right? We heard a little bit earlier on the first panel, the difference between a Latina and Latino voter in the mayoral race and what some of that turnout showed. But I would love to ask both of you right now, given that the three of us were actually part of the Sell of Votes program, which was an effort and an initiative to really start to build a capacity in Southeast LA with community-based organizations who are seen as trusted messengers and ensure that there is some type of integrated voter engagement effort that's happening in the Southeast. I wanted to ask, what are some of the things that, as you were doing this work, and Ultimed has already been doing this, but I think both of your organizations had already previously done some voter outreach work. What are some strategies that you have seen resonate? We've heard Lisette as far as like the trusted messenger. That's also something that we know that exists with COFEM. But in addition to that, what is it that really resonates with the patients or your members or your clients that really starts to kind of light a switch or motivate someone to want to become more engaged in elections? And I'll pass it to you, Oscar, first.
Yeah, so what gets people excited about getting connected is through friends. You know, so our civic promoters bring their friends along to, let's say, a press conference. People have probably never been to a press conference before, and then there's all this energy and there's all this excitement. We typically bring mariachi and we play music, and it's that combination of doing something meaningful, you know, in advocating for certain policies or agenda items, but also making it fun. That you could have a good time in doing this too. And there's a balance. And with our civic promoters, they're friends. They're connected with each other, and you know they call each other up and like, hey, let's go. We're gonna go do this and that. That's sort of connection kind of brings the engagement into fruition, where it's you're having a good time doing this. It's not a chore, essentially. And you know, I just wanted to just quickly touch on something that Lizette's presentation had, is that through canvassing, you know, going door to door, knocking on people's doors and looking them in the eyes and saying, hey, are you going to vote this year? Makes a big difference, because they can't hide from that response. They're going to give you a response. They'll say yes or no. And typically, you know, you could have a conversation. There is no sure plan where you could say this, you do this and people will vote. There's nothing out there that could guarantee a vote. What we could do is increase the odds of them voting. And that's essentially what COFEM and Sell Votes was trying to do, is increasing the odds of people to vote. And if it shows that knocking on their door and texting them or calling them increases that odds, then that's what we have to do. And the data shows that too. So it proves and it shows on paper that the Sell Votes campaign is effective. What we need is to bring in more partners and expand our civic promoters program, really invest in that, because the community leaders, empowering them to inspire others, that's what democracy is all about. That's what it is. And the trusted messenger is probably the key to this. Seeing your aunt or your uncle, maybe even your brother or sister involved in the community, it will make you inquire. I'm like, oh, why do they do this? What are they doing? or seeing your neighbor and just going out to knocking on doors. I'm like, well, what are they knocking on doors for? Well, it's just increasing the odds. That's all. That's probably the only surefire way, if there is any.
Right. And that goes back to how we are leveraging our relationships in the community based off of a number of issues that our organizations are working on in the community, right? And being able to go back to them and say, well, we talked about this healthcare issue. Let's talk a little bit more about what impacts that issue. Lizette, do you have a couple comments on that before I dive into my next question to you?
Sure, I would say a lot of organizers have said this throughout the years, right? But there's no substitute for field, right? There's an opportunity to overlay. We did a lot of overlay with like digital, so that when we were getting to folks' stores, they've been served some sort of video, right, of us. But really, those one-on-one conversations, there's no substitute for that. Interestingly, in Southeast LA, we didn't get a whole lot of people shutting their doors on us or anything like that, right? We were reaching low propensity voters. These are folks who are often ignored by campaigns, by candidates. And for the most part, folks were welcome to a conversation about the process of voting and voting itself. For us, the message about voting for your health resonated well for folks on either side of the aisle. For them, it was really just like, yes, my health is really important. Tell me more about how it impacts my health. So that message is non-part. We've seen national polls, local polls talk about how Latinos identified healthcare and the cost of healthcare as a top priority issue for them on elections. We use that right at the doors, and that resonated very, very well for us. And then the last piece is we did do a day where we actually took our doctors in white coats to knock on doors. That was probably our most successful canvassing day for us, because folks were able to make those connections at the door. They're very welcoming because they really do trust their doctors for the most part, at least in the Southeast LA communities we went to. So that was highly successful for us and something that we'll continue to explore for our work.
A doctor coming to my door would definitely be very unique, telling me to vote. There is a question in the chat I'm going to skim over really quickly. It asks any suggestions for increasing voter turnout. I've already heard the cultural relevance component of it, right, Oscar? This is work that is fun, right? And this is work that is also important in how we're connecting that. But if you can answer this next piece, which is previous research has shown that when accounting for equal turnout, Latinx can have increased representation and better outcomes. But how do we harness that power? Institutional reforms are a piece of the puzzle, plus organizing. But what else is it that we're missing? Lizette, do you want to take a shot at that first?
Yeah, I would say a couple of things, like increase reforms, yes, but also increase investment. We need the Secretary of State to continue to invest in Latino voters. We need the Registrar of Voters to look at where, what's missing, what's the additional outreach. In many ways, a lot of us are doing the work, right, for the Secretary of State in the education piece. And so continued investment is very important. Investment year round, similarly important. A lot of us, COFEM, ABC, CHIDLAS, right, of the world, we want to do this integrated work year round, but we need the investment to be year round as well, so that by the time every election comes, it's a culture of civic participation that we've created in the Latino community and in the households, to where they see voting as an obvious thing that they're going to do together as a family. But coming every 6 weeks before an election and knocking on folks' door, great, and we do the best that we can, but it's not enough, right? And so continued sustained investment. The process to voting, even though California has made it as way easier than most states, it still is a very complicated process and very confusing for our community. A lot of folks don't trust the drop boxes. That was a big one for us, educating people on like, what are the different modalities of voting? Are they safe, et cetera, in ways that, again, we as CBOs can do, but in the way that's necessary to increase turnout. There's still a lot more that needs to be done. But again, investment, sustainability, long-term, and then having other service providers and large entities and large organizations that serve, and even big companies that serve a massive amount of our community members to jump in this work with us. is key.
Great. And Oscar, let me move on to this next question. Given that you all were leading and had among the highest turnout of knocking on doors within the Sell the Votes groups, and have built on a history of promotor outreach, peer-to-peer outreach programs, what is it that your promotores and the staff heard on the ground? What was it that was a voting priority in the Sella community specifically?
You know, a lot of the things that we heard on in the field was when we asked them if they had a plan to vote. They would either say yes or but it always came down to, you know, I haven't done my research. I don't know how I'm gonna vote. And I think that it could be for various different reasons. It could be procrastination. They just are too busy working. We've got to take into account the people that we're talking to. In the community, these people have 2 jobs. They've got families, they've got kids. We do this full time. We have that privilege of doing this all day. My civic promoters, it was a little difficult even to get them to come out all the time because life gets in the way. There's other things, there are other priorities, and I totally get that. I could be out there, but you know, I gotta work with them too and be flexible. And I think that when it comes to, you know, mail-in voting, that really changed. It changed a lot because it made voting a lot more accessible. You get the ballot, like you don't even have to ask for it. They tell you, okay, you just got to mail this in, and it's up to us to just encourage them to. And you know, on the field, we have these all these conversations with different types of people, and you know, when it comes to the Latino vote, it is very diverse. It is we got to take into account that we're talking about people and cultures that cannot be generalized in just a little we just say this is Latinos here. We're talking about an entire continent. We have South America, we have the Caribbean and Central America and Mexico. Very, very diverse ideologies, and a lot of these ideologies. Well, let's take it. If we look at, I don't want to get too, I don't want to go too far, but if you look at Cubans, you know, and the way that they vote in Florida, and the messaging that Republicans use to get them is very effective, and it speaks to where they come from, and it speaks to their culture and their fears too, which is a big thing, you know. And if you look at, let's say, Chile with Pinochet and everything, so we're talking about a vast, you know, diverse group. And when you know, the people elected, people who are looking to get elected, people who are in charge of these the elections, once they realize that the Latino vote can't be wrangled, you gotta seek them out, things will change.
Right.
Well, it's up to us.
Yeah,
it's up to us first to organize and to show that flash of power.
right.
But once people realize that, you know, you can't take the Latino vote for granted anymore, that you have to get them to buy into what you are seeking to achieve, then we will see more turnout. That's what I think is a solution, and that's what I've learned from just the conversations with the civic promoters. Not all of them vote the same way. I could tell you that for sure, and not all of them actually are able to
we're definitely a very diverse voting bloc. I want to be mindful of time as we're wrapping up. We did get a little late start, but I want to ask one last and final question. It's the same question we asked our first panelist. What are some key lessons from what you've gathered in the last year? And what is your one recommendation for the audience here today as we look to gear up for 2023 and then, of course, building into 2024? Lizette, we'll start with you.
Yeah, I think for us, it's Ultimate, healthcare providers, healthcare plans, healthcare institutions, big role. We need to recruit more. We will continue to recruit more community health centers across the country and healthcare plans, right, to kind of do this work. We play a pivotal role. And the idea of voting for your health is a message that resonates with everyone across the board, especially with Latinos, right? And I already mentioned continued and sustained engagement, but investment as well is very important. And the one last thing that I'll leave folks with to think about is everything that we've talked about here. We've said we don't have the formula that's going to get us at 100% turnout, right? Let's not even get into voter registration because that's a whole other issue. This is just turnout.
Right.
So let's try new things. Let's be creative. Let's be strategic. Let's think big. We have an election in 2 years, some local and special elections actually coming up next year. So let's test and let's see what happens.
That's great. Oscar, one recommendation as we leave here today that you want to have our audience really think about as they leave.
You know, there's this quote that says, I think it was Churchill that said it, you know, is to improve is to change, and to perfect is to change often. And so when it comes to our GOTV efforts and our outreach efforts, we got to keep what works and then change and be able to pivot whenever we need to keep getting better and encouraging voter turnout and getting people engaged. And keep what works and toss out what doesn't. It's just being able to accept when you need to change.
Thank you for saying that. And thank you both for joining us on this panel. I want to really highlight the greater understanding of the fact that, you know, our Latino community is such a huge portion of the Los Angeles population, of the population across the state, and of course the country, but particularly here in Los Angeles, really understanding and growing that comprehension that the vitality of Latinos today will yield greater results for all communities tomorrow, and really ensuring that investments are targeted in our communities, because when we all thrive, we all thrive. And when it comes to voter engagement and voter outreach, it really is a reflection of the thriving democracy. So I want to thank you, Lisette and Oscar. I want to add one piece that it's so encouraging to know that you are our future, our current and our future generation, the next. I was once in your position, but you know, now you are the next phase of generational leaders. And it's so exciting to know that you are both building what you are building and part of leading a lot of these efforts for our communities. So that's also very encouraging. But I do want to also thank Dr. Serwani, Veronica Carizales, and Efrain Escobedo for joining us today. May you all have a wonderful rest of the week, and always remember to continue to engage our communities. Thank you, everyone.